I'm really delighted to introduce Rupert Wegerif and Louis Major, who lots of people in the room I'm sure already know. And we'll be launching their very timely new book, The Theory of Educational Technology Towards a Dialogical Foundation for Design. And the last session was such a good preliminary to this because we heard about what a critical juncture we're at. It seems correct, as Wayne said, that we are at the peak of a hype cycle. So what comes next? Next, we have the very difficult business of trying to integrate generative AI into education. And that's exactly what this book will be so helpful for. It offers a nuanced and sophisticated approach for understanding how to realize educational possibilities at the interface between theory and design. And they have a framework for this, which is crucially grounded in educational values and educational practices. And it's an important book, which has come at a very important moment for education, both in terms of generative AI and the wider suite of technologies we've talked about over the course of today. And so in the first part of the session, Louis and Rupert will talk about their book.
Thank you very much, Mark. We've heard today about a number of rich perspectives about the possibilities of education technology and what it might play in the future of education. And I think one of the common themes that's been coming through is around this idea of design. Education is about design. It's not about describing the world, it's about changing it. And it relates to that point we had in the previous session about the builders. We are the builders prior to coffee. And technology appears like it is addressing and fundamentally shifting some of these fundamental educational questions. What should we teach and learn? How should we teach and learn it? And implicitly within that, why should we teach and learn it? And these issues of design, the shaping of these fundamental questions are what we address in our new book that Rupert is demonstrating here, The Theory of Educational Technology Towards a Dialogic Foundation for Design. And in it, we argue that technology has been treated as a supplement to education, traditionally, and we argue that it is central. We also argue that new technology demands new ways of thinking about education, and we propose this dialogic theory. This is part of an ongoing conversation. We don't profess to have all the answers, at least I don't think so. So we look forward to engaging with you in that conversation. So to just give a quick overview around what the book entails, 11 chapters, focusing first on an introduction, then we present an alternative history of educational technology, going back to the Sandbushman caves and the earliest stages of the schools in Sumeria, working all the way forward to some of the things we've been discussing today, the evolution of the printing press, for instance. We then look at one of the seminal theories that have been applied to educational technology, this idea of affordance from James Gibson, Don Norman, looking at that through a dialogic lens, before moving on in chapter 4 to this idea of the grammar of educational technology, looking at things like Skinner's teaching machine, Pappert's constructionism, and Barreto and Scardamalia's knowledge building. Through that, we then move in chapter 5 to develop a new dialogic grammar, building on theories such as Heidegger, often applied to studies of education technology, again, looking at that through this dialogic lens. In chapter 7, Rupert's favourite philosopher, Gilbert Simondon, who many of you may have heard of through him, looking at what it means, what the meaning of technology means, before moving on in 8 and 9 to consider the idea of expanding dialogic space and time, and then before concluding with an evaluation of how we might research and develop education technology, and in 11 proposing this foundational framework. Just like to say a big thank you to the many colleagues in the room who have supported us on this journey while we take responsibility for the final text. Colleagues in corridors, at conferences, have helped us along the way. So a big thank you to DEFI colleagues, DEFI, Jude, everybody else, to CEDA, colleagues, the research group that we worked on this together in Cambridge, led by Sarah Hennessy, to Mark and the new initiative that we've started in Manchester around this through our new research group. And yeah, on that note, I'm going to pass over very briefly to Rupert, just to say a few words to frame the book before we engage in a discussion.
Oh, thanks, Louis. Yeah, so actually, Louis and I, along with Mark Anderson and Sarah and others, were very active in creating DEFI a few years ago. And I would like to see this book as offering a theoretical foundation for what we're trying to do. So we've had some talk today about this recent bubble. I actually did a PhD in education technology, the Institute of Education Technology, an awful long time ago, back in the early 90s, and the latest big thing was AI in education. We were all building intelligent tutoring systems. It was going to transform education. There was a TV series. We knew it was going to happen. And then now, finally, it sort of appears to be happening. And so I think that's kind of exciting, but we need to root our enthusiasm in a bigger historical perspective. And one of the issues that this book starts with is that the theory of education, when it is mentioned in education technology papers, is usually theory that has nothing to do with technology, that's been developed in a rather naive way out of the current education system, as if technology is something different. This is actually rather a good book by a great education writer, Martin Robertson, but you see how it's Athena, wisdom, against the machine. The machine is almost invariably, technology is always invariably mentioned in a rather negative way. It's instrumental, it's a machine-like, it's not human. The human's supposed to be good, technology is supposed to be bad. Maybe because technology doesn't have much of a voice. I'm rather worried about that. And personally, I find a lot of the nasty things that happen seem to be pretty human, and quite a lot of the good things in my life are based on technology. People often say education should be driven by pedagogy and not by technology. I understand what they're trying to say, but is that really a truism? Is that really right? So that's why the book goes right back to the beginnings of education. And then you can see that actually when people are treating technology as something new that is an addition, that we should stick with human pedagogy, maybe they're just referring to previous technology. The first schools, which are very similar to modern schools in many ways, because we have quite a lot of records of them, were created in ancient Sumeria, apparently, and obviously this is perhaps a bit of a simplification, but the research is there, to deal with the complexity of large numbers of people living together for the first time. So they needed contracts and they needed shared stories, and therefore they needed a technology. And what could be more technological than writing on bits of clay with little sticks and so on? And so schools were developed to teach people this skill. Apparently it was quite difficult. There was a lot of correcting homework and punishments and all the rest of it. It was a new technology to support a new technology, if you like. Similarly, basically, what we've got at the moment and what we seem to take for granted is a print tech literacy system. Humans have actually always been bound up with technology. It's not true that technology is inhuman or different from the human. The issue seems to be that our, if you like, biological technology, because I think you can look at it, the natural technology evolves rather slower than the external technological aspect of being human, and then you need education to help us catch up. So if people living together need communications technology, then you need formal education to provide it. And this was actually made very explicit by some of the pioneers who created the modern system. Comenius in the 17th century actually designed the system that's now used in America, the same middle schools and secondary schools and colleges. He was very active as an inspiring leader in promoting a rationalist education system based very much on textbooks, and he was explicit about this, that this is actually printing onto the students' minds. And this has certain consequences. So the opportunity we have now with this new technology might help us rethink what do we mean by education. I haven't met many literate people who don't think it's obvious that everybody would benefit from literacy. If you look at education programs, it's all about increasing reading, writing, and arithmetic around the world. Actually, many indigenous people have not had a very good experience with their oral cultures being destroyed by literacy. Literacy obviously has been wonderful, but it has side effects and affordances. If AI can write papers better than our students, maybe we should think, why are we focusing on writing? Is that what education is? What is education really for? As Louis mentioned, well, you know, Socrates, who was very much an oral thinker, pointed out that writing isn't a very good idea. You read a speech, you sound clever. Real intelligence requires you to answer questions, to explain, to play across different perspectives. And you don't really get that with writing. Writing can tend to promote this idea of thinking as some kind of formula. I think this is a product of, you know, things being framed in a page. Oral thinkers, and actually, I'm not just saying that Stanislas Dehaene did some fantastic research on how education into literacy actually limits your holistic thinking and promotes your analytic thinking. There's a change in thinking. So rethinking what thinking is, we can suggest that meaning is a spark across difference rather than some kind of formula. And so the ways we think about knowledge, this is actually a picture that we saw earlier from Kevin, the idea that it's not about a representation of the truth that can be printed in a book. This is a side effect of our print literacy technology. It's actually about relationships. To know somebody isn't to know them from the outside, it's to enter into a relationship with them. And the same is true of every area of knowledge. It's about participation and relationship. At least that's a suggestion. So this is where the dialogic framework comes from, prompted by our understanding of this capacity of AI. This is a well-known example. The point of education is not to use AI for our existing ends. It's to learn how to collaborate more effectively with the technology. This is the Centaur model from Kasparov, who, as you probably know, having been beaten by a machine, he came back with a better model. Humans working with computers. The computers can do the data crunching, can do the fantastic memory. The humans can do the intuition and the creativity. So we're suggesting that future education, in order to respond to the challenges that were mentioned, challenges like global warming, challenges like how do we deal with the power of social media? We can't go back. We can't prevent people from having smartphones and also, of course, we're actually, I have to say, in many ways, we're doing rather well. I mean, my great-grandparents were killed in a massive pandemic rather similar to the one we had, called the Spanish flu in 1918. We didn't have the capacity to collaborate globally and respond in the way that we did this time. So the point is, how do we educate for that inevitable future of collaborating with machines? And one way is to go, not just to go forward, and to think about the challenges of the future and hang education off that, which we've had these discussions from Fawaz and Imogen about how we can do that. I actually think this future scenario planning should be incorporated into all education. It shouldn't just be about, oh, we teach these things because they succeeded in the past. It should be, what are we going to need for the future? How can we join together in a participation in designing the future? And this also takes us back to what is the real role of education. It's not just about print literacy. These marvelous account from Lewis Williams, who was a professor of cognitive archaeology at Witwatersrand. Fortunately, they were able to interview some of the people who participated in the use of cave paintings that were as old as those in Europe, in Altamira and Lascaux, around 40,000 years old. And the point of the painting was, if you like, to preserve the stories of the culture and to participate in them. Hence the many hand paintings as you actually continued the culture. So it's about expanding the consciousness and identity of the group by connecting individuals to that collective and collecting that moment in time to the much larger history, which is what we're always doing with technology in education. Cave paintings like the first technology. And so how can we do that? If it's about expanding dialogue and dialogic space through pedagogy, oops, I think I'm hitting my 10 minutes. I'll zip forward. Basically, we're suggesting that this marvelous example of how we developed human flight. We knew what we wanted. We didn't actually, it wasn't just about applying theories, it was about trying things out and learning by trying things out. And that's what I think we're doing at the moment. We had some fantastic examples here, all these new enterprises developing new ways of using AI in education. We know roughly what we want to achieve, which is education to promote human flourishing in order to survive, and more than that, to thrive in a future which is kind of inevitably more complex and integrated. Now, the problem with that, of course, is the threat to human freedom. And that's where this dialogic model comes in. When a dialogue works, the participants are actually empowered and taken forward by that participation. It seems to involve a threat, it seems to involve some initial giving up of some sovereignty, but we all have the experience of how that can be a positive benefit in terms of increased empowerment and possibilities of action. And that's why we need to explore the use of education technology to enable this transition to a very different human future. So perhaps the question we should be asking isn't how can we use technology to help our education system, but why does technology need education, and what kind of education does it need? I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you both. That was a really fascinating question to finish on, Rupert.
Yeah.
And your talk had been very theoretical, but then you brought in design at the end. And that's the first thing I wanted to ask the two of you about. So what I found so compelling about the book was it's a dialogue between theory and design. How do you see the interface between them? How do you see that relationship?
I think, if I go first, first of all, I think theory is really quite off-putting often, isn't it? And it's really quite difficult to access. But yet every time we stand in front of a class, every time we design a particular feature into the tool, we are thinking about theory, aren't we? We've got an implicit theory on why we're presenting things in a particular way, why we're defining that button in a particular way. So it seems like technology and theory are completely intertwined, but perhaps, to now haven't actually, often that link could be made slightly more clear, I think. What do you think, Rupert?
Yes, I was kind of shocked by the kind of research methods we use in education are based on sciences which have a theory and then you apply it, nomothetic. You do a little experiment, control study. Whereas what you actually need in education, because it's not really about describing reality, it's about changing reality. How do we change reality? So you want design experiments, but you want to make sure they're not just small experiments where you think you know already what we need and you implement it. You have to design them in a way which enables you to reflect on your deep underlying theories and feed back into it. And I actually think that's a way of rethinking all of that we've been doing in science, really. Ultimately, it was driven by human needs, and it feeds back into our designs, and we want to make that relationship a closer and more iterative, used by applying this design research, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we've heard today about some of the design challenges we face with generative AI. Things like ensuring equity, mitigating biases, promoting critical thinking. How can your theoretical and your design approach help us negotiate these challenges?
Well, I mean, we don't have, obviously, answers. These are complicated challenges, and that's the point of science and design-based research is a certain amount of humility that in the past people have always had these tech gurus who said, oh, we should all do this and it's going to work. Well, it usually doesn't work, so you do need to try it out. But ultimately, I'm actually slightly cautious about our sense. We use these words, these values quite easily, equality, diversity, inclusion. I think you're using them. But shouldn't we test these out? Ultimately, these are going to be tested by human flourishing. Well, let's actually base this on an inclusive design workshop dialogue where we bring in the interests of everybody and we find what works. It's not easy, it's never perfect, and so this is actually basically an idea from Habermas, the ideal speech situation, but I think that's what we're trying to do. I hope I wasn't being too controversial there. Does that make sense?
It does.
And also just thinking about Steve Watson's mention of these 3 different ways that generative AI, I think that was really prompting me to reflect that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Like it is multi-leveled. So when we ask a question like that, there's so much to potentially unpack, isn't there? I think one of the things with educational design-based research is something that's come up repeatedly today is the human in the loop, the importance of the practitioner perspective, and that people matter, I think Rebecca Scott said. And I think that's one of the big advantages of design research, or variants of it, is that, just try and incorporate those voices into when we're tackling these complex issues to which there is no one answer.
Well, because in the book, you maintain quite an optimistic perspective, but are there things about this landscape that trouble you? And how could your book support policymakers, technologists, teachers in responding to these challenges?
I mean, I've been writing notes all day. It's been such illuminating talks. I mean, the last session alone, talking about things like algorithmic bias, the digital divide, I think Charles Clarke earlier, the lack of a coherent strategy at policy level. And I think we heard previously about lack of regulation. But for me, it's Wayne's point about these cycles of hype. And I think that comes through when we consider the historical perspective in the book. 1920s, video was going to revolutionize distance learning. 1950s, Skinner's teaching machine is going to take the pressure off the teacher in the classroom. 1970s, 1980s, AI, computer-assisted learning, internet, and then iPads. I don't know if I'm just being a bit too skeptical. Maybe Rupert's a little bit more positive than me. But I just look at these cycles of hype. And the first paper on AI in education was written, I think, in 1986. And I think, have we been here before? I don't know. Maybe a bit too negative.
I personally am immensely grateful for what has happened. I think progress is very easy to not see very well unless you actually go back and you see through the eyes of our ancestors and what they wanted. I'm one of our ancestors. When I was young, I was desperate for more access to information. Anywhere I travel now in the world, with a relatively cheap machine, almost everywhere I can find the infrastructure's been built, we have access to more information than I could have dreamt of. Not to mention Netflix programs from China, from Korea, from Mexico. I'm just amazed and in awe of how much we've achieved. And I'm kind of shocked by how ungrateful everybody is and how they endlessly complain. Of course, there are difficulties and problems. But have there not always been problems? Were our grandparents having an easier life? I don't know about you, but mine certainly weren't. And our challenges we faced were incredible, and the poverty was incredible. Sorry, why am I? I'm just giving a defense of progress here. But of course, inevitably, there are problems and issues. We've heard recently Meta almost admitting to damaging the lives of young people. And I think that's where this design model is so important, to understand that we don't have the answers, that there are always problems with any technology, and that we should be very alert, not just to the narrow questions, does this machine work to do what it was achieving, but what are its consequences, what are its side effects? Well, let's do that in a constructive spirit, aware of all the progress that we've made as a human race over the last 1,000 years. Let's put it in a big picture, over the last 3,000. And the first schools, 3,000 BC? We've come a long way, we've achieved an enormous amount. Let's try and be constructive. In order to move forward, we have to constantly criticize, challenge, develop. We need the pluralism of different solutions, different countries working in different ways, in order to have a dialogue between those different solutions so that the best way forward can emerge. Sorry, am I getting all carried away now? Is that an answer, though, Mark?
Yeah, just to begin to draw to a close, that's one of the most distinctive features of the book, I think, that you tell a story about education as being bound up with technology from its inception. And you've hinted at this in your talk and in the discussion so far, but could you say any ideas about what this means in practice for design?
Well, it means that we ought to understand that our education systems, that we ourselves are to some extent technology on the inside, and that in the process of education, we are educating future generations who will intimately be entangled with the technology. So we talk about AI literacy and the need for concern about bias and ethics and so on, but more fundamentally, we need to prepare people to work effectively with the technology in order to move forward to human flourishing on a planetary scale and the idea of collective intelligence. So it should shift what we're talking about in education. We should put technology at the heart of it and listen to the voice of technology and ask, what does technology want and what does it need? Up till now, everyone answers that question as if it's some sort of instrumental rationalization, maybe because technology has been constrained by people who were trying to maximize their profits. But if we actually look at what technology is asking of us, it's the technology on the inside that draws me beyond my biological limits. As a biological organism, I'm looking for food. I'm angry when people stop me getting food. I get very cross. It's only the technology on the inside that enables me to leverage that perspective, to see the bigger picture. Through technology, I'm in touch with the heart of the universe. Through the Webb telescope, through science and technology, we are called to expand ourselves as if every point in the universe wants to connect to every other point. So I feel technology is leading us forward, and we should listen to it instead of dismissing it and imagine we humans, as humans, have all the answers and the technology is that bad stuff. No, let's embrace it and work with it to move to something different and larger.
Well, I was going to, at this point, ask for questions from the audience, but that feels like quite a high-pressure moment.
Oh, sorry.
To make
I was overdoing it.
But
yeah.
we've got time for a couple of questions before we draw to a close for the day. Anyone?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I think that why do you think that technology is a human? I mean, it's because of the process of design is made by humans, so that the technology is a human.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
Yeah.
That's definitely one for you,
Well,
Rupert.
I'm partly influenced by Bernard Stiegler, a French philosopher, as a student of Derrida, and he points out, that the human species is separated out from other apes only because of technology, only because of fire and tool use, and clothing and so on. We have always only existed with our technology. The technology is not the other of human any more than a spider's web is the other of a spider. But as the technology changes, then what it means to be human changes. So we're not talking about being post-human or anti-human, but we are talking about being augmented human, a humanism that includes our technology instead of rejecting it, and therefore embraces the fact that we have to work collaboratively in a complex integrated system with many of the voices are not simply other human voices, but they're technological voices, they're AI voices, and we have to learn how to work constructively with them. So it's there's a tension between the aspects. The humans have many aspects. Well, ultimately, the book is arguing and building on theories that would suggest that perhaps there aren't separate intelligences. There's only one cosmic intelligence that is working its way out through nature, through machines, through humans. As the great physicist Schrödinger said, perhaps there's only one consciousness that takes different forms. So maybe this fixation with the human isn't necessary. Maybe using technology, we can open up our borders and realize, as the quantum physicists would say, that we're a superposition with the cosmos. And the thinking that goes on in snowflakes or in lightning strikes, this is the kind of thinking that we participate in. It's going beyond the human. And technology can help us to do that.
Yeah, it is just about that, isn't it? Just recognizing that technology might not necessarily be a tool that we use for our ends. But I think your question, Matthew, around the role of the human in all this, and this is why we advocate a design-based research approach. Imogen mentioned it earlier as well, one that can bring in this idea of partnership to develop these technologies in order to incorporate that human voice in a way that's a little bit more, hopefully, going to lead to the kind of progress that Rupert mentioned.
Yeah, I do think you're a post-humanist, Rupert.
Yeah. But
one more question?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. On your slide there, Rupert, you've got planetary-wide collective intelligence. In the past, perhaps land was a barrier, money was a barrier, Do you think that access to data is a barrier to achieving that planetary-wide collective intelligence?
Yes, of course. Well, Kevin mentioned his work in Africa. He's just come back from Ghana. As I understand, in many parts of rural Africa, it's very hard to get access to the internet and data. But I'm just impressed by how fast these things are spreading, how Huawei's been working in sub-Saharan Africa building infrastructure. The infrastructure is spreading and developing, and I think that one could imagine a future where this stuff is almost free. Let's hope that we're moving in that direction. It's certainly reduced enormously in price. I mean, in my lifetime, as in yours here, and I'm sure we can see, a vast increase in the access and free availability of data. Is that sort of an answer?
I think you do point as well. Just
It was more, not so much the physical access, but actually it seems that people are holding on to data.
Oh, right.
And is data the new sort of gold or oil or whatever else? Because if I have all the data in the world, then you can have all the access, but you can't actually do anything without my data.
I think it's a really important point, and one that also points on a more pragmatic level to the issues of scalability and sustainability of EdTech interventions. Where is this data being stored? What are the costs around that? I think Mark and I were talking recently that each ChatGPT command might use up a teaspoon of water. I mean, when you think of the environmental impact, if that is actually true and not just conjecture, I mean, that is scary, the amount of nonsense that we're pumping into ChatGPT, and where do we hit a level that it's just not sustainable for the companies who are running these things, or for other aspects of sustainability as well. And I think for all EdTech developers, this question of scalability is always an issue, isn't it? You can make anything work in a classroom if you had 5 teaching assistants, 30 iPads. It's true though, isn't it? And then when we think of going, how do we move to scale? And again, I think it comes back to this question of design-based research. That's not necessarily got all the answers, but at least by including a range of voices, community groups, developers, researchers working in partnership together, we might stand the chance of building something that could scale and sustainably.
You don't have all the answers, but you have a sophisticated, practical and timely way of asking the questions and approaching it. And that captures to me why this is such an important book. So let's give them a round of applause, everyone.
Thank you.